General Sarah Martinez stood at exactly 5 feet 4 inches tall, which made her shorter than most of the soldiers under her command. At 42 years old, she had silver threads weaving through her dark brown hair that she kept pulled back in a neat bun. Her uniform was always perfectly pressed, and she wore minimal makeup that highlighted her sharp green eyes. To most people who didn't know her background, she looked more like a strict librarian than a military leader. The 3 recruits sitting in the back of the mess hall didn't know her background. Tommy Rodriguez, Jake Peterson, and Marcus Williams had only been at Fort Braxton for 2 weeks. They were fresh out of basic training, full of confidence, and convinced they knew everything about military life. The 20-year-old men had spent their evening meal complaining about their new assignment. "I can't believe they stuck us with her," Tommy muttered, stabbing his mashed potatoes with unnecessary force. He was the tallest of the 3, with broad shoulders and arms covered in tattoos that told stories of his tough neighborhood back in Detroit. "A woman general? Come on." Jake nodded in agreement, his blonde hair catching the fluorescent lights above their table. He came from a family of Marines and had expected to follow in their footsteps until an injury redirected him to the Army. "My dad says female officers are just there to fill quotas. They don't have what it takes when things get real." Marcus, who had been quiet up to this point, finally spoke up. He was the smartest of the 3, having scored highest on all their written tests. But he was also the most skeptical about authority figures. "Look at her. She probably got that rank by playing politics and staying behind a desk. I bet she's never seen actual combat." The general in question sat 3 tables away, eating her dinner alone while reading a thick manual. She seemed completely absorbed in the technical document, occasionally making notes in the margins with a pen. Her meal was simple: grilled chicken, vegetables, and water. She ate methodically, like everything else she did. "I heard from Sergeant Collins that she's supposedly some kind of special forces background," Tommy said, lowering his voice but not enough to actually be discreet. "But come on, look at her. Special forces? More like special needs." The other 2 recruits snickered at the crude joke. They were young and foolish, believing that size and gender determined capability. Their instructors in basic training had been traditional men who had filled their heads with old-fashioned ideas about women in combat roles. $20 says I could take her down in hand-to-hand combat," Jake boasted, flexing his biceps for effect. He had been the star athlete in his high school and had never lost a fight in his life. "She probably learned her moves from a YouTube video." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying the general more carefully. "You know what? I bet all 3 of us could take her at once. She can't weigh more than 120 pounds soaking wet." General Martinez continued reading, giving no indication that she could hear their conversation. But her posture remained perfect, and her eyes occasionally moved to scan the room in a way that suggested constant awareness of her surroundings. She had learned long ago to listen without appearing to listen. Tommy's voice got a little louder. "We should test that theory. What's she gonna do? Write us up for asking for a friendly sparring match? Isn't that what soldiers are supposed to do?" The mess hall was fairly empty at this late hour. Most soldiers had finished dinner and moved on to evening activities or returned to their barracks. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the smell of industrial food lingered in the air. A few other soldiers sat scattered around other tables, but none were paying attention to the conversation happening in the back corner. Jake stood up first, his chair scraping loudly against the tile floor. "Come on! Let's go ask the general if she wants to show us some of those special forces moves. Politely, of course." Marcus and Tommy exchanged glances before standing as well. They were feeding off each other's confidence, each one trying to prove he was tougher than the others. It was a dangerous combination of youth, ignorance, and ego that had gotten many soldiers into trouble throughout military history. They approached General Martinez's table with the swagger of young men who had never been truly tested. Their boots clicked against the floor in an uneven rhythm that announced their approach long before they reached her. She didn't look up from her manual until they were standing directly beside her table. "Excuse me, General," Tommy said, his tone respectful enough on the surface, but with an underlying current of challenge. "We were wondering if you might be willing to demonstrate some combat techniques for us." General Martinez marked her place in the manual with her finger and looked up at the three recruits. Her green eyes moved from face to face, taking in their expressions, their postures, their intentions. She had seen this type of soldier before, young, untested, and convinced of their own superiority. "What kind of techniques did you have in mind?" she asked quietly. Her voice was calm and steady, without any hint of intimidation or anger. Jake stepped forward slightly. "Well, we heard you have Special Forces experience, and we'd love to learn from someone with your background." He emphasized the last word in a way that made it clear he doubted that background existed. "Hand-to-hand combat specifically," Marcus added. "We've been working on our skills and could use some pointers from an experienced officer." General Martinez set down her pen and closed the manual. She stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. Even standing, the top of her head barely reached Jake's shoulder. The size difference was dramatic and obvious. "You want to learn hand-to-hand combat techniques," she repeated, her tone unchanged. "Yes, ma'am," Tommy said, barely containing a smirk. "We thought maybe you could show us a few moves. Nothing too aggressive, of course." The general walked around the table to face all three recruits directly. She clasped her hands behind her back in a standard military pose and studied their faces for a long moment. The mess hall seemed to grow quieter around them, as if the building itself was holding its breath. "Are you sure that's what you want?" she asked finally. The three recruits exchanged confident glances. They were sure they had her figured out. A small woman playing soldier, probably scared to actually demonstrate the skills she claimed to have. They nodded eagerly. "Absolutely, General," Jake said. "We're ready to learn." General Martinez looked toward the kitchen area where a few staff members were cleaning up for the evening. "Clear some space," she called out calmly. "We're going to need room to move." The kitchen staff looked surprised, but began moving chairs and tables to create an open area in the center of the mess hall. Word spread quickly, and within minutes, a small crowd of soldiers had gathered to watch what was about to happen. The general removed her uniform jacket, revealing a simple black t-shirt underneath. Her arms were lean but defined with muscle, and several small scars were visible on her forearms and hands. She rolled her shoulders once, a subtle warm-up motion that the recruits missed entirely. "Rules are simple," she announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "No weapons, no hitting below the belt, no eye gouging. When someone says stop or taps out, we stop. Understood?" The three recruits nodded enthusiastically. They were practically bouncing on their toes, eager to prove their superiority over this small woman who had somehow managed to fool the army into giving her a general's rank. "Who wants to go first?" General Martinez asked, her hands still clasped behind her back. Tommy stepped forward without hesitation. "I'll take that honor, General." The crowd of watching soldiers grew larger as word spread throughout the building. Some came expecting to see their general humiliated, while others came because they knew something the recruits didn't. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. General Martinez and Tommy faced each other in the center of the cleared space. The height and weight difference was even more obvious now, with Tommy towering over her by nearly a foot and outweighing her by at least 60 pounds. "Whenever you're ready," she said quietly. Tommy grinned and raised his hands into what he thought was a fighting stance. He had learned some basic moves in high school wrestling and figured that would be enough against a woman half his size. What happened next would become legendary in the halls of Fort Braxton for years to come. Tommy lunged forward with all the grace of a charging bull, expecting to overpower General Martinez through sheer size and strength. His plan was simple: grab her, throw her to the ground, and prove his point about women in combat roles. He never got the chance. In one fluid motion that seemed to defy physics, General Martinez stepped to the side, caught Tommy's extended arm, and used his own momentum against him. Her movements were precise and economical, like a dancer who had practiced the same routine 10,000 times. Tommy found himself airborne for a brief moment, before crashing onto the mess hall floor with a sound that echoed throughout the building. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds. Tommy lay on the floor, gasping for air and trying to figure out what had just happened. The wind had been knocked out of him, and his shoulder felt like he had been hit by a truck. He looked up at General Martinez, who was standing exactly where she had been before, hands clasped behind her back, looking completely unruffled. "Anyone else?" she asked calmly. Jake and Marcus stared in shock. The crowd of watching soldiers had grown to nearly 50 people, and the silence was deafening. Some of the older soldiers in the group were nodding knowingly, while others looked as surprised as the recruits. Jake stepped forward, his face red with embarrassment and anger. "Lucky shot," he muttered. "Tommy just slipped." "Perhaps," General Martinez replied. "Would you like to try your luck?" Jake was bigger than Tommy and had more fighting experience. He approached more cautiously, keeping his hands up and his weight balanced. He had wrestled in college and knew how to move his body efficiently. It didn't matter. This time, General Martinez didn't wait for Jake to make the first move. She stepped forward and performed what looked like a simple grab, but Jake suddenly found himself spun around with his arm twisted behind his back in a hold that sent lightning bolts of pain through his shoulder and elbow. She applied just enough pressure to make her point without causing permanent damage. "Tap out," she said quietly in his ear. Jake struggled for a moment, trying to use his superior strength to break free, but every movement only increased the pain. Finally, he tapped her arm 3 times with his free hand. She released him immediately and stepped back. "Next," she said, turning to Marcus. Marcus had been watching more carefully than his friends. He was the smartest of the 3, and he was beginning to realize they had made a serious mistake. But his pride wouldn't let him back down now, not in front of all these watching soldiers. "Different approach," he said, circling the general slowly. "I'm not going to charge in like an idiot." General Martinez didn't turn to follow his movement. Instead, she stood perfectly still, her eyes tracking him but her body remaining centered and balanced. She looked like a predator, waiting for prey to make a mistake. Marcus feinted to her left, then tried to tackle her from the right. His technique was actually quite good, and he managed to get his arms around her waist before she reacted. For a brief moment, he thought he had succeeded where his friends had failed. Then the world turned upside down. General Martinez had somehow gotten underneath him and lifted his entire body weight off the ground. Before he could process what was happening, she had thrown him over her shoulder in a perfect judo throw. He landed hard on his back, the air exploding from his lungs in a painful whoosh. All 3 recruits now lay on the floor, defeated and humiliated in less than 2 minutes combined. The watching crowd had grown larger, and someone started clapping slowly. Soon the entire mess hall erupted in applause. General Martinez helped Marcus to his feet, then Jake, then Tommy. Her expression showed no trace of smugness or satisfaction. She looked at them with the same calm professionalism she brought to everything else. "Now," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "let me tell you something about assumptions." She walked back to her table and picked up her uniform jacket. As she put it back on, she began to speak in a clear, carrying voice. "My name is Sarah Martinez. Before I became a general, I spent 12 years as a Navy SEAL. I was part of SEAL Team 6, the most elite special operations unit in the United States military. I have served in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and several countries I'm not allowed to name." The mess hall was completely silent now. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their cleaning to listen. I have participated in over 200 combat missions. I have jumped out of airplanes at 30,000 feet, swum miles through freezing ocean water, and lived in deserts for weeks with nothing but what I could carry on my back. I have been shot twice, stabbed once, and blown up by an IED that killed 2 of my teammates. She paused to let that information sink in. The reason I'm telling you this is not to brag. It's to illustrate a point about judging people based on their appearance. When you see someone who doesn't fit your preconceived notions of what a warrior should look like, your first instinct might be to dismiss them. That's a mistake that could get you killed in combat. Tommy struggled to his feet, his face burning with shame. General, we didn't know. Of course you didn't know, she replied, not unkindly. But that's exactly the problem. You made assumptions based on incomplete information. In the real world, that kind of thinking gets people killed. She walked over to where the 3 recruits stood, still catching their breath and nursing their bruised egos. Do you know what the most important skill in special operations is? She asked. It's not physical strength, though that's important. It's not weapons proficiency, though that's crucial too. The most important skill is the ability to assess situations accurately and adapt quickly when your initial assessment is wrong. Jake rubbed his sore shoulder and looked down at the floor. We screwed up, didn't we? You made a mistake, General Martinez corrected. Screwing up would be if you failed to learn from this experience. She turned to address the entire crowd that had gathered. The military has changed significantly over the past 20 years. We have female soldiers serving in every combat role, including special operations. Some of the best snipers I've worked with have been women. Some of the toughest soldiers I know are barely 5 feet tall. Size and gender don't determine capability. Marcus finally found his voice. How did you... those moves. 12 years of training, 8 hours a day, she replied simply, plus natural talent and excellent instructors, the same way anyone gets good at anything. She picked up her manual from the table and prepared to leave. Here's what's going to happen next, she announced. Tomorrow morning at 0600 hours, you 3 will report to the training facility. We're going to start your real education about combat techniques, and I'm going to personally make sure you understand the difference between confidence and arrogance. Tommy stepped forward. General, we want to apologize. We were completely out of line. Apology noted, she said. But actions matter more than words. Show me tomorrow that you can learn from this. She started to walk toward the exit, then stopped and turned back to the 3 recruits. One more thing, she said. The next time you decide to challenge someone, make sure you know who you're dealing with. In Afghanistan, that kind of poor intelligence gathering would have gotten your entire unit killed. The message was delivered without anger or malice, but it hit home harder than any shouting match could have. As General Martinez left the mess hall, the crowd slowly dispersed. The 3 recruits sat back down at their table, too stunned and embarrassed to speak. Their dinner had long since grown cold, but none of them had any appetite anyway. We really messed up, Tommy said finally. Big time, Jake agreed. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, thinking about what had just happened. You know what's crazy? He said finally. She could have really hurt us. Those moves she used. She held back. A lot. The other 2 looked at him with new understanding. They had been completely outclassed by someone who hadn't even tried her hardest. Word of the incident spread through Fort Braxton like wildfire. By morning, every soldier on the base knew the story of the 3 recruits who had challenged General Martinez and learned the hard way about the dangers of making assumptions. At exactly 0600 hours the next morning, Tommy Rodriguez, Jake Peterson, and Marcus Williams stood outside the training facility in perfect formation. They had arrived 15 minutes early, their uniforms pressed to perfection, their boots polished until they could see their reflections. None of them had slept particularly well, spending most of the night replaying their humiliation and wondering what General Martinez had planned for them. The training facility was a large building that housed various workout equipment, mats for hand-to-hand combat practice, and obstacle course elements. Through the windows, they could see other soldiers already beginning their morning routines. The sound of weights clanking and people shouting commands filtered through the walls. General Martinez appeared precisely on time, walking toward them with the same calm, measured pace she brought to everything. She wore standard military workout gear, gray army t-shirt, black shorts, and running shoes. Even in casual clothes, she moved with an unmistakable sense of purpose and authority. "Good morning," she said simply. "Follow me." She led them inside to a large room filled with exercise mats. The walls were covered with mirrors and pull-up bars hung from the ceiling at regular intervals. It looked like any other military gym, except for the collection of framed photographs on one wall showing various special operations teams in different locations around the world. "Before we begin physical training," General Martinez said, "we're going to have a conversation about respect, assumptions, and what it means to be a soldier." She gestured for them to sit on the mats in a circle. It felt strange, sitting casually with a general, but they followed her lead. "Tell me," she said, looking at each of them in turn, "what did you think you were proving last night?" Tommy was the first to speak. "Honestly, I thought we were going to show everyone that you didn't belong in your position. I thought we were going to expose you as weak." His honesty was brutal, but General Martinez simply nodded. "And why did you think that?" "Because you're a woman," he admitted. "And because you're smaller than us. I grew up thinking that meant you couldn't be as tough as a man." Jake shifted uncomfortably, but knew he had to be equally honest. "Same here. My dad and my uncles are all Marines, and they always said women in combat was just political correctness gone wrong. I believed them." Marcus had been thinking about this all night. I think I was scared that if women could do everything we could do, it meant we weren't special anymore. Like our whole identity as strong men was being threatened." General Martinez listened to each confession without judgment. When they finished, she was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Your honesty is appreciated," she said finally. "Now let me share something with you. When I was going through SEAL training, I had to prove myself every single day. Not just to my instructors, but to my teammates who thought exactly the way you did last night." She stood up and walked to the wall of photographs. "See this picture?" She pointed to a group photo of soldiers in desert camouflage. "That's my unit in Afghanistan. 3 of those men died saving my life during an ambush. They didn't care that I was a woman when they threw themselves on top of me to shield me from grenade fragments." The 3 recruits looked at the photo with new eyes, trying to spot the general among the faces. "And this one," she continued, pointing to another photo, "shows the mission where I carried Staff Sergeant Williams 3 miles through enemy territory after he was wounded. He outweighed me by 80 pounds. But when your teammate is bleeding out, you find strength you didn't know you had." She returned to the circle and sat back down. "The point is, gender becomes irrelevant when bullets start flying. What matters is training, courage, and the willingness to sacrifice for your teammates." Tommy raised his hand tentatively. "General, how do we get past our prejudices? I mean, I know I was wrong, but it's hard to change thinking that's been drilled into you your whole life." "Good question," she replied. "The first step is recognizing that you have them, which you've already done. The second step is consciously working to see people as individuals rather than representatives of a group." She gestured around the room. "Every soldier in this building has a unique story, unique strengths, and unique challenges. Your job is to learn to evaluate people based on their actions and their character, not their appearance or your assumptions." Marcus leaned forward. "What was the hardest part of SEAL training for you?" General Martinez smiled slightly, the first time they had seen her show any emotion other than calm professionalism. "Honestly, it wasn't the physical challenges, though those were brutal. It was earning the respect of men who saw me as a liability rather than an asset. "How did you do it?" Jake asked. "By being better prepared than everyone else," she said. "I knew I would be judged by a different standard, so I made sure I exceeded that standard every single day. I studied harder, trained longer, and pushed myself further than I thought possible." She stood up again and walked to an equipment rack filled with various training tools. "Which brings us to today's lesson. You challenged me based on your assumptions about my physical capabilities. Now I'm going to challenge you based on your actual physical capabilities." The next hour was the most intense workout any of the three recruits had ever experienced. General Martinez put them through a series of exercises that tested not just their strength, but their endurance, flexibility, coordination, and mental toughness. She demonstrated each exercise first, performing movements that seemed impossible for someone her size: push-ups with her feet elevated on a bench, pull-ups with additional weight attached to her belt, a core routine that left the much younger men gasping for breath while she barely seemed winded. Everything she did was executed with perfect form and unwavering focus. "The body achieves what the mind believes," she said, as they struggled through a particularly difficult sequence. "Most people never push themselves hard enough to discover their real limits." By the end of the session, Tommy, Jake, and Marcus were completely exhausted. They lay on the mats, sweat-soaked and trembling, while General Martinez looked like she had barely warmed up. "This is what 12 years of elite training looks like," she said, not boastfully but matter-of-factly. "This is what you get when you dedicate your entire life to becoming the best possible version of yourself." She handed each of them a towel and a water bottle. "Your homework assignment is to research the history of women in combat, not just American military history, but throughout the world. Russian snipers in World War II, Kurdish fighters against ISIS, Israeli special forces. I want you to understand that what you witnessed last night wasn't an anomaly." As they prepared to leave, Tommy worked up the courage to ask the question that had been bothering him all morning. "General, why didn't you just have us written up for insubordination? You could have ended our careers before they started." General Martinez considered the question carefully before answering. "Because you're young and teachable. Because your mistake came from ignorance rather than malice. And because the military needs soldiers who can learn and adapt, not soldiers who are simply punished for their errors." She paused at the door. "Besides, some of the best soldiers I've ever served with started out as knuckleheads who needed to learn humility the hard way." Over the following weeks, the relationship between General Martinez and the three recruits evolved dramatically. They showed up early for every training session she offered. They studied military history with newfound passion. Most importantly, they began to see their fellow soldiers differently, evaluating people based on merit rather than preconceptions. Tommy discovered that one of the female soldiers in his unit was actually a former Olympic-level athlete who could outrun and outshoot most of the men. Jake learned that physical size meant nothing when it came to tactical intelligence and leadership ability. Marcus found himself seeking out diverse perspectives instead of surrounding himself with people who looked and thought exactly like him. 3 months later, during a large-scale training exercise, the three former troublemakers found themselves assigned to a unit led by Captain Jennifer Walsh, a female officer with a reputation for tactical brilliance. Instead of questioning her authority, they listened carefully to her briefing and followed her orders precisely. The exercise involved a complex night mission that required stealth, coordination, and split-second decision-making. Captain Walsh's unit completed their objectives faster and more efficiently than any other team, earning praise from the commanding officers. After the exercise, General Martinez approached the three recruits as they were cleaning their equipment. "I heard about your performance tonight," she said. "Captain Walsh was impressed." "She's incredible," Tommy said enthusiastically. "The way she planned that approach route was genius." 6 months ago, "Would you have taken orders from her without question?" General Martinez asked. The three men looked at each other and shook their heads. Honestly? No, Jake admitted. We would have been looking for ways to prove she was wrong. And now? Now we know that leadership comes from competence, not chromosomes, Marcus said. General Martinez nodded approvingly. You've learned the most important lesson the military can teach: how to evaluate people accurately and work effectively with anyone who shares your commitment to the mission. As she walked away, Tommy called after her. General, thank you for not giving up on us. She turned back with that slight smile they had come to recognize. Soldiers aren't born, they're made. My job is to help make you the best soldiers you can be, regardless of where you start from. The story of the 3 recruits who challenged General Martinez became part of Fort Braxton folklore, but not as a tale of humiliation. Instead, it became an example of how prejudice could be overcome through honest confrontation with reality and how good leaders could transform problematic soldiers into valuable team members. Years later, all 3 men would go on to distinguished military careers, marked by their ability to work effectively with diverse teams and their reputation for evaluating people based on merit rather than appearance. They would often tell the story of their first encounter with General Martinez, always ending with the same lesson. Never assume you know what someone is capable of until you've seen them in action. And General Martinez continued to lead by example, proving every day that true strength comes not from size or gender, but from dedication, skill, and an unbreakable commitment to excellence.